Good morning! I am WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to the first episode of Space is Wide and Friends Are Too Few. The birth of Trans-Newtonianism. It is really hard to parse out the history of the human race from the start of the Industrial Revolution until World War III. It's bad, but it wasn't all bad all the time for all people. Even if one just looks at the 21st century, the one that started with a major terror attack in its second year, followed by most major nations becoming entrenched in unwinnable wars that just drained their resources. During this time, most people in most nations had a very livable life that was far better than the vast majority of humans throughout the vast majority of time. What started the war was a proxy fight between several nations caught in a very complicated alliance system. In fact, several of them on various sides were technically allied with each other as they fought this war. At the time that this happened, both of the major powers in the world were led by very jingoistic leaders, and when both tried a round of brinkmanship to get the other to back down, much to the surprise of only those two leaders, neither backed down, and a massive war spiraled out of that mess. In the early 22nd century, the world finally pulled itself out of the mess it had created for itself, and created a world government called the Earth Federation, made up at the time of 500 million people. 2128 is cited as the year that Earth surpassed its old self. Excerpt from Karl Franz's book, A Brief History of the Early Days of Trans-Newtonian Flight. Introduction. Random House Books, 2853. Dr. Lillian Zapata collapsed into her chair. It was a long night at the end of a long, almost 4 years. Just before the war began, there had been some mentions in the personal effects of several of the world's leading physicists that pointed at something very odd being out there. But they weren't ready to openly talk about it yet. There was Newtonian physics, also known as classic mechanics, which described the macro world and how things interacted and worked on that scale, and then there were quantum physics, or quantum mechanics, which worked on the micro world and how things worked on that scale. And that was fine and good, and the better part of 2 centuries of advancements worked due to one or the other or both of these sets of understandings. However, there were 2 elements that seemed to violate Newtonian physics, and Dr. Zapata had seen the letters about these elements. One was called mercasium, and the other was sorium. Sorium was the more interesting of the 2, as it could fairly easily be refined into a fuel-like substance that redefined the understanding of how things operated in space. A normal rocket engine in space, using sorium rather than other more conventional rocket fuels, would accelerate instantaneously and critically safely for all those inside, and would have discrete speeds it would travel the solar system at. As the Earth Federation formed, Dr. Zapata started petitioning to get resources to fund her studies into these 2 elements to see what use they might have. In 2125, she finally got her resources, and it was more than she expected. There were 5 laboratories left in the world that could handle the sort of large-scale experimentation she was looking to do. And the Earth Federation gave her full use of all 5 of them. Before 2125 was over, she had discovered that mercasium and sorium were not the only two elements that reacted in what she called Trans-Newtonian physics. There were a total of 11, and together they could completely change the way humanity operated. Iron, steel, plastic, silicon, these would become things of the past, at least at the governmental level. Instead, gallicite, uridium, and boronide, among others, would be the building blocks of government and government projects. Her latest achievement in the last couple of years was the construction of the Earth Federation Shuttle Enterprise, a mostly standard shuttle that was half the size of the old NASA shuttles, had 20 crew members, was captained by Captain Sylvania, and could travel around at 105 kilometers a second. In the first flight of the Enterprise, Captain Sylvania traveled to the moon and back in just over 2 hours. And now, looking at the large screen in front of her, she knew she was done. They had fully explained how each of the 11 elements worked together, and she had created a new field of physics. Humanity would never be the same. Even without waiting for the optimal conditions and windows to line up, a conventional engine that ran on Sorium could travel to Neptune, the farthest planet from the Sun, from Earth in under 2 years, down from the 12 years that NASA could do when it lined everything up optimally. The fastest ship that NASA had ever launched could make it to Proxima Centauri in about 54,400 years, while Sorium brought the time down to 12,142 years. Now, that was still prohibitively long, but just over 12,000 years sounds a lot more doable than 54,000 years. She would spend the next couple of days writing up the report, and then it would be done. But first, she needed to sleep. Lillian got out of her chair and left her office, heading toward the dorm she had been using. Sid was reeling. Today had been a long day, and would go down as one of the strangest he had ever had. First, he started the day at an award ceremony, where he was awarded the medal First to the Solar System. And it was a medal made just for him, in recognition of him being the first commanding officer to leave Earth in about 100 years. Then he was promoted to Commodore from Captain in another ceremony. And then, in the third and final ceremony of the day, he was assigned as Commander of the Earth Federation Space Navy. This posting was apparently because he was the best candidate for the job, as he was the only officer who had experience running a ship that worked on Trans-Newtonian physics. And he was also the ranking officer in the laughably tiny space corps that the Earth Federation had. He had a new desk, a new office, a new staff. He had exactly one ship under his command, the EFS Enterprise, and only one shipyard, the Buckwalter Weatherspoon Shipyard Limited, the shipyard that built the Enterprise. He also had several old ICBM silos and the missiles that would go with them. Those ICBMs traveled at 10 kilometers a second, versus the Enterprise and its 105 kilometers a second. They were less than useless. The only thing they would be good for would be destroying the Earth some more than it already was. But with a single government, that was unlikely to happen. There really wasn't much else he could do, though. He was briefed that Tamala Perks would be, at least temporarily, taking over command of the research labs from Dr. Zapata to try and find a way to create sensors that would detect Trans-Newtonian minerals on places other than Earth. And Commander Tyron York, his logistics officer, informed him that 20% of the world's current manufacturing infrastructure was in the process of being upgraded into Trans-Newtonian capable construction facilities. But until all of the upgrading to a Trans-Newtonian economy was finished, there really wasn't much he could do. They were very limited in construction space, and all of it was being used to fund this upgrading. Everything was so new, and Trans-Newtonian physics was so alien, that he couldn't even really plan for the future because of how much was not known about how things would work even a few years from now. 2130 would look upon an Earth that would be almost unrecognizable to those who saw it in 2120. Sid stood in the front of the observation room of the Buckwalter Weatherspoon Shipyard Limited, slip number 1. The entire front wall was a large window that looked out onto the slip and the ship currently illuminated in it, with Earth forming a nice backdrop. He had been the commander of the Earth Federation Space Navy for almost 3 years now, and this was the first real thing he had done in that time. The Enterprise was being relaunched as a Shuttle B. The only difference between now and before was it had a large ship-based geological sensor. This ship is the present of mankind. It is not the future, because it is the here and now, in a time of rapid growth and change. This ship, and its rebranding, signifies that growth and change. I captained this ship for 3 years, and in that time, my crew traveled extensively between the moon and the Earth, and most of the space in between. Now the Enterprise will travel to the moon and far beyond, searching for new deposits of Trans-Newtonian elements. There are projections that we'll be able to mine on alien worlds within 4 years, and the goal of the Earth Federation Space Navy is to be ready for when that day comes. We will have the targets already set out. Humanity will explore the solar system, and the Earth Federation Space Navy will be the vanguard of that exploration. After he finished his speech, Commodore Sylvania was given the honor of controlling the unmanned dock robot holding the traditional champagne bottle, and he smashed it against the brow of the Enterprise, being very careful to hit a small iron plate attached to the bow just for this purpose. The ceremony ended with Sid officially giving command of the Enterprise over to Lieutenant Commander Quinn Dufries, the second best officer in the fleet when it came to reading the output of the scanners. The best officer, Commander Monty Weaving, was already the head of the fleet survey at the fleet headquarters. Transmission from EFS Enterprise, orbit around the moon, to Earth Federation Fleet Command. Commodore Sylvania. We have finished our surveying of the moon, and we have found several deposits. The moon contains duranium, tritanium, and vendorite, all in excess of 1 million tons and fairly easily accessible. There are no traces of the other 8 elements, but after conferring with my geological survey officer, we agree that it would be a good idea to send teams of geologists to do ground truthing in the future after orbital scanning. Ground-based scanning should result in more accurate results than orbital scans could ever give. We are breaking orbit after transmitting this message and heading to Venus to scan there. Lieutenant Commander DeFries. Transmission from EFS Enterprise. Orbit around Mercury. To Earth Federation Fleet Command. Commodore Sylvania. After finishing scans on Venus and Mercury, we have found Trans-Newtonian elements everywhere we have looked. Some deposits on Venus and Mercury are measured in the tens of millions of tons. Stepping foot on Mercury was a memory I will treasure for the rest of my life. To be the first human to set foot on another planet. I will be eternally grateful for receiving this command. Lieutenant Commander DeFries. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of Space is Wide and Friends Are Too Few. Tune in later tonight, where I will have a bonus video, I think. Either way, I'll have a video tomorrow. Thank you.